Just over 10 years ago, way back in September of 2009, I had finished seminary and was preparing to move from Lexington, Kentucky to Moorhead, Minnesota for my first ministerial call. I had finished up my clinical pastoral education unit in Lexington, and I had a move-out date on the calendar of October 15th. I had a fair amount of time on my hands, and so I gave in to my inner planner, and I began arranging all of the things that needed to be done for my upcoming move. I even started to pack weeks before I would be departing. Now, if you know me, this will make some sense, and if you don't, well, this may give you a glimpse into the person that is me. I made arrangements with the moving company that would be transporting all of my stuff from Kentucky to Minnesota, and given the amount of time I had, I chose the self-pack option. So I began the process of packing up my home. First, I went about getting boxes, most of which came from the company themselves, and then I started to fill them. It was an incredibly organized process. I had learned a little something the last time I had made a big move, 3 years prior when I moved from Southern California to Lexington. I had learned the reason for the very specific sizes of the boxes to be used in packing, because I thought it would be easier and just more efficient to simply pack all of my books in one of those larger appliance boxes. It took a dolly to move that box, and I'm pretty sure it ripped at some point. So this time around, having learned my lesson, I packed all of my things in the appropriately sized boxes. And I will say it was an incredibly satisfying experience, putting everything into boxes so well organized, well defined with labels for which rooms where they would land in my new home, perfectly contained. I also learned a lesson about how much stuff I actually needed because I was packed a solid 3 weeks before I moved, and I think I opened 2 boxes to get something out of them, and I didn't have much else that wasn't packed. As an aside, and to slip in just a little bit of bragging, I will tell you that when the movers arrived to inventory my things, they commented that mine was the, and I'm quoting here, best self-pack they had ever seen. Reveling in the compliment, I chose not to tell them that I had had about a month to pack everything up. I don't know about you, but I like organizing things, putting them away in the places where they belong, sometimes in tight little boxes. I know exactly what's inside. I get the feeling that the Sadducees in our story this morning are a little bit like that, or maybe a lot. Playing the role of antagonist in this particular story, as they so often do in the stories about Jesus' ministry, these faithful leaders in the first century Jewish community are portrayed as people who seem to like rigid definitions, putting things into tidy boxes. We get a sense of this as they attempt to question Jesus into a corner, asking him what they believe to be a real stumper, a head-scratcher about the idea of resurrection. Whose wife will it be anyway, in the resurrection, that is? This is one of those moments when I really, really see the differences between Jesus and me, and there are a lot. Faced with such a question, I would have likely attempted to come up with the right answer. I would have willingly accepted the terms of the Sadducees' inquiry and been satisfied with the box that I had been handed. But not Jesus. As he does time and time again in our gospel accounts, Jesus, when presented with a choice of as many as 7 options on this particular multiple choice exam, options A through G, if you will, Jesus finds a way to answer H, none of the above. In essence, he tells them, you're not asking the right question, and redirects them to a wholly different point, and one that offers much greater meaning. In that moment, Jesus takes the opportunity to pivot and makes clear that matters of life and death, as understood by humans, cannot be so easily contained in the boxes into which we attempt to place them when they involve God. For God is much more and far-reaching than we can possibly contain in worldly boxes. In the midst of pondering this particular scripture this past couple of weeks, I've kept finding my thoughts returning to the last line when Jesus makes reference to how Moses spoke of God as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Throughout time, one of the great and spectacular ways we as people of faith have tripped all over ourselves is when we try to strictly define who God is or whose God is. When we try to put God into our boxes. My friends, God is so much more than we can possibly imagine. And God's love is far more far-reaching than we know, even perhaps than with which we might be comfortable. Fed by some aspect of our wider culture, we far too often get caught up in being right about things. And then we apply that to our experience of church and to our faith, when what is important is not being right or being rigid, but being faithful. Faithful in our beliefs, faithful in our doubts, faithful in our sense of inquiry, faithful in our affirmation of others, faithful in how we choose to share of ourselves. It's when we get caught up with being right that troubles arise and schisms develop. We start talking about the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God. Or we debate who God is for us as Christians compared with who God is for our Jewish brothers and sisters or our Muslim sisters and brothers. We even get caught up in pointless debates about the different gods among various Christian traditions, Catholic or Protestant, conservative or progressive or evangelical. And all of this debate for what? Because we honestly believe that one day we are going to convince someone else that our God is the right God, the true God? Unlikely. Perhaps we feel like engaging in the debate proves something about our faithfulness. We are willing to lay it on the line and put ourselves out there. Perhaps we think we're proving something to God. Unnecessary. Or maybe we think that when the day of judgment arrives, we will somehow have won the game because we had all the answers right. Uninspired. Besides, when we engage in such efforts, all we are really doing is attempting to put God in a box of our design, a box with which we are comfortable, a box that can only serve to constrain our own understanding and prevent our own growth. And as I have already pointed out, should we look to the exemplar of our faith tradition, we know well that Jesus was not a fan of boxes. Instead, Jesus is calling us to open our hearts and minds to something more, something that makes our boxes irrelevant because they cannot possibly contain what is out there for us to discover. A little over a week ago, we observed All Saints' Day on the 1st of this month. And one important aspect of that sacred day is that we are reminded of those who have come before us, and we give thanks for that which they have gifted us. We are blessed with the stories of our past and hundreds of years of Christian tradition, even more than 100 years of history and tradition here at Manhattan Beach Community Church. And all of that blesses us with a sense of who God has been for the great cloud of witnesses that have preceded us. But we do not, or at least should not, construct a box for God based solely on our past. For while God is the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and the God of Moses, and the God of Jesus, and of Peter and Paul, God is much more than that. For God is also the God of Miriam, and the God of Deborah, and the God of Mary, and all the other voices that history and tradition seem to forget or gloss over. But even when we listen to those voices, helping us to understand who God is, we cannot construct a box at that point either. For God is also the God of Frederick, and the God of Sojourner, the God of Martin, the God of Rosa, the God of Harvey, and the God of Matthew, the God of Teresa, and the God of faithful people throughout time and tradition who have sought to expand our understanding of just how far-reaching God's love truly is. And even then, when we have taken in the learnings we have received from these amazing saints, we cannot construct our box, for we are still missing voices, ignoring perspectives. For God is also the God of Heschel, and the God of Helen, the God of Mahatma, the God of Indira, the God of Leon, and the God of people of faith across the amazing continuum of faith traditions present in our world. And while we may be tempted to start building our box at this point, we must again resist that temptation. For our understandings of God are not limited to what we carry forward from the past. We recognize and celebrate a still speaking God, God who continues to reveal God's self today in our midst. And so God is also the God of John, the God of Aaron, the God of Don, the God of Jean, the God of Nancy, the God of Ray, the God of Bill, the God of Sally, the God of Jennifer, Susie, Kristen, Irene, Deanne, Pat. The God of each of us gathered in this place, and for each one gathered in houses of faith around the world, and for all people of faith across the face of this planet. And even then, we cannot construct our box, for my friends, God is also the God of Gemma, the God of Bella, the God of Mateo, the God of Colin, Lilia, God of Thomas, the God of every child in our midst, every child who runs or walks, skips or wheels on this earth, and for every child that is yet to be born. In the midst of our baptisms, we affirm this truth as we invite the God who has spoken for every person to speak for the one to be baptized, claiming them as a beloved child of God with a divine spark, welcoming them into the cloud. And each of them will know God in a special way, and each of them will tell us those ways that will contribute to a broader and greater and deeper understanding of who God is. So let's just forget about the box and stop worrying about being right, and instead let us be faithful, demonstrating openness to belief in God who is God of all people, and to celebrate that in God all of our many and wonderful perspectives live and breathe and grow. Let us open ourselves to being surprised by God, to being touched by God in new ways as we allow all of God's people to show us who and whose God truly is. For now, God is not God of the dead, but of the living. For to God and in God